Jake Morrison sat in the back row of his xenobiology class at the Galactic Educational Institute, watching Professor Zeth Kari pace back and forth in front of the holographic display. The crystalline alien stood nearly 8 feet tall, his body made of what looked like living purple crystal that caught the light with every movement. Jake had been at the Institute for 6 months now, one of only 50 humans among thousands of alien students from across the galaxy. Today's lesson was about primitive civilizations and their building methods. Jake half listened as the professor droned on about cave dwellings and mud huts, occasionally glancing at his fellow students. There was Kron, a reptilian being whose scales shifted from green to brown when he was bored. Next to him sat Pip, a small, furry creature who looked like a cross between a squirrel and a monkey. Lisa Chang, another human student from the engineering track, sat 2 rows ahead taking careful notes. Professor Zeth Kari stopped pacing and turned to face the class. His crystal face somehow managed to look smug, despite having no real features. "Now we come to one of the most ridiculous examples of primitive architecture," he said, his voice echoing like wind chimes in a storm. "The tree dwelling. Some backward species actually believe that building crude shelters in vegetation is somehow acceptable." Jake felt his jaw tighten. He knew exactly what the professor was talking about. The holographic display showed images of various tree-based structures from different worlds, including several that looked remarkably similar to human tree houses. These pathetic attempts at construction show a complete lack of understanding about proper engineering, Professor Zeth Kari continued. "Any civilized species builds on solid ground using appropriate materials. Only the most primitive minds would think that hanging a shelter from a plant makes any sense." A few alien students laughed, their various sounds creating a strange chorus. Jake noticed that most of the laughter came from species that built underground or in crystal formations. The tree-dwelling species in the class remained silent, looking uncomfortable. Jake raised his hand. Professor Zeth Kari's crystal head turned toward him with obvious reluctance. "Yes, Human Morrison." "Actually, Professor, tree-based construction can be extremely sophisticated," Jake said, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "Human tree houses demonstrate advanced understanding of load distribution, environmental integration, and sustainable building practices." The laughter died away. Professor Zeth Kari's crystal body flashed a deeper purple, which Jake had learned meant irritation. "Human Morrison, I hardly think your species is qualified to lecture on advanced construction techniques. Humans are barely evolved primates who still think hanging wooden boxes from branches constitutes architecture." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks but kept his voice steady. "With respect, Professor, that's not accurate. Human treehouse construction requires understanding of tree biology, seasonal growth patterns, wind load calculations, and material stress analysis. We don't just hang boxes from branches. We create integrated structures that work with the tree's natural systems." Several students turned to look at Jake with interest. Kron's scales had shifted to a curious yellow color. Even Lisa had turned around to watch the exchange. Professor Zeth Kari's crystal form flashed brighter. "Integrated structures? You mean crude platforms held up by rope and nails? Any first-year engineering student from a proper civilization could design something better in minutes." "Actually," Jake said, standing up slowly, "human treehouse engineering often surpasses ground-based construction in several key areas. We've developed techniques for flexible joinery that allows structures to move with the tree during storms. We use living supports that grow stronger over time instead of weaker. We create buildings that actually improve the environment they're built in rather than destroying it." The classroom had gone completely silent. Professor Zethkari's crystal body was now pulsing with angry purple light. Improve the environment? By nailing foreign objects into living plants? This is exactly the kind of primitive thinking that holds back species development. Jake felt something snap inside him. 6 months of listening to subtle insults about human intelligence and culture had built up like pressure in a steam pipe. You know what, Professor? Maybe the problem isn't with species that build in trees. Maybe the problem is with species that are so disconnected from nature that they can't understand working with living systems instead of against them. The purple pulsing stopped. Professor Zethkari's crystal form went completely still. What did you just say? Jake realized he had crossed a line, but he was too angry to care. I said maybe if your species spent less time growing crystals in sterile environments and more time understanding biological systems, you'd realize that working with nature instead of dominating it is actually more advanced engineering, not less. A few students gasped. Pip made a small squeaking sound. Lisa was staring at Jake with wide eyes. Professor Zethkari's crystal body suddenly flashed brilliant red, so bright that several students had to shield their eyes. When the light faded, the alien's voice was like breaking glass. How dare you suggest that the Nexus Collective's construction methods are inferior to primitive tree climbing? I'm not suggesting it, Jake replied, his voice getting stronger. I'm stating it as fact. Your crystal cities are beautiful, but they're completely dependent on artificial systems. They can't adapt, they can't grow, and they can't repair themselves. A well-built treehouse will still be standing and improving 50 years from now. Your crystal towers need constant maintenance and eventual replacement. The red light was now pulsing so fast it was almost strobing. Professor Zethkari's voice rose to a shriek. Constant maintenance? Replacement? Our crystal architecture has stood for 10,000 years. In controlled environments with no weather, no natural disasters, and constant energy input, Jake shot back. Put one of your crystal cities in a real environment with storms and seasons and wildlife, and see how long it lasts without your artificial support systems. Professor Zethkari's crystal form went completely white. For a moment, Jake thought the alien might actually explode. Then, without another word, the professor turned and walked toward the classroom door. His crystal feet clicked against the floor with each step, the sound echoing in the dead silence. At the door, Professor Zethkari stopped and turned back to the class. I will not waste any more time trying to educate species too primitive to understand basic engineering principles, he said, his voice cold and sharp. This class is dismissed. Permanently. The door slid shut behind him with a soft hiss. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the whispers started, alien voices mixing with human ones in a dozen different languages. Jake slowly sat back down, his heart pounding. Lisa turned around in her seat to stare at him. Did you just make our professor quit? She asked. Jake looked around the classroom at 50 pairs of alien eyes all focused on him. Some looked angry, some looked impressed, and some looked worried. I think I might have, he said quietly. Kron's scales shifted to an amused orange color. That was the most interesting xenobiology class we have had all semester, the reptilian said in his hissing voice. But Jake was already thinking ahead. Making a professor quit in the middle of class was not going to go unnoticed by the administration. He had a feeling his real problems were just beginning. Jake spent the rest of the day expecting to be called to the dean's office, but nothing happened. He went to his other classes, ate dinner in the cafeteria, and even managed to get some sleep. But the next morning, his door chimed with an official message. Dean Morteff wanted to see him immediately. The dean's office was located in the highest tower of the institute, with windows that looked out over the sprawling campus and the wilderness preserve beyond. Dean Morteff was an insectoid being about, Jake's height, with 4 arms and compound eyes that seemed to look in every direction at once. His chitinous exterior was a deep blue-green color that shifted slightly as he moved. "Human Morrison," the dean said as Jake entered, gesturing to a chair with 2 of his arms while continuing to work on a holographic display with the other 2. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." Jake sat down carefully. The chair was designed for multiple body types and adjusted automatically to his human form. "Dean Morteff, I want to apologize for what happened in Professor Zethkari's class. I shouldn't have lost my temper." The dean's compound eyes turned toward Jake while his other 2 arms kept working. "Actually, Human Morrison, the situation has become considerably more complex than a simple classroom disruption. Professor Zethkari has filed a formal complaint with the Galactic Education Council claiming that humans are culturally incompatible with higher learning." Jake felt his stomach drop. "What does that mean?" "It means," Dean Morteff said, finally stopping his work and giving Jake his full attention, "that your species standing at this institute is now under review. Professor Zethkari has claimed that humans are too primitive and aggressive to benefit from galactic education. He is demanding that all human students be reclassified as remedial and required to take additional cultural sensitivity courses." Jake stared at the dean. "He's trying to get all humans kicked down to lower-level classes because I argued with him about treehouses?" "Essentially, yes." Dean Morteff's mandibles clicked together, and what Jake had learned was the equivalent of a sigh. "The Education Council takes cultural compatibility very seriously. They have reviewed the recordings of your exchange with Professor Zethkari, and they have decided that the matter must be resolved through demonstration rather than debate." The dean activated a new holographic display showing official documents. "You will be given an opportunity to prove that human construction methods are not primitive. If you succeed, the matter will be considered closed. If you fail, all human students will indeed be reclassified." Jake leaned forward in his chair. "What kind of demonstration?" Dean Morteff's compound eyes focused on Jake with laser intensity. "You will be provided with access to the Institute's Wilderness Preserve. You will have 7 standard galactic days to construct a dwelling using only materials available in that environment and only hand tools. The structure must meet basic habitability standards for long-term occupation by a sentient being." Jake blinked. "That's it? Build a shelter in the woods in a week?" "That is correct. However, there are additional parameters. The structure must demonstrate the advanced engineering principles you claimed human tree-based construction possesses. It will be evaluated by a panel of architects and engineers from 5 different species. If they determine that your construction is primitive or inadequate, your species will be deemed unsuitable for advanced education." Jake sat back in his chair, his mind racing. A week to build something impressive enough to change the minds of alien architects who already thought humans were primitive. It should have been impossible. But Jake was thinking about the summers he had spent with his father in Oregon, learning to build tree houses that could withstand Pacific Northwest storms and last for decades. "I accept," Jake said. Dean Morteff's mandibles clicked rapidly. "You accept? Just like that? Human Morrison, do you understand what failure means? It does not just affect you. It affects every human student at this institute." "I understand," Jake said, standing up. "When do I start?" The dean studied Jake for a long moment. "Very well. You may begin tomorrow morning. You will be transported to the preserve and left with basic hand tools and survival equipment. No communication devices, no outside assistance, no materials not found on site. Jake nodded. Can I see the preserve first? Get familiar with the terrain and available materials? Of course. I will arrange for a survey trip this afternoon. Dean Morteff paused. Human Morrison, I feel obligated to warn you that the preserve was chosen specifically because it is considered unsuitable for construction. The terrain is uneven. The trees are too large or too small for conventional building, and the soil composition makes ground-based construction extremely difficult. Jake grinned. Sounds perfect for a treehouse. That afternoon, Jake took the transport to the Wilderness Preserve with Lisa and a few other curious students who had heard about the challenge. The preserve covered about 40 acres of dense forest with a small stream running through the middle. The trees were massive, ancient specimens that towered over everything else. The ground was rocky and uneven, covered with thick underbrush. This is impossible, Lisa said, looking around at the terrain. How are you supposed to build anything here? You can't level ground this rocky, and those trees are too big to cut down with hand tools. But Jake was already seeing possibilities. The massive trees had perfect branching patterns for multi-level construction. The rocky ground that made conventional building impossible actually provided excellent drainage. The stream meant fresh water access. The dense canopy would provide natural climate control. Lisa, Jake said, walking over to examine a particularly impressive oak tree. What do you know about load-bearing calculations for flexible supports? Some. Why? Because I'm not going to build on the ground, I'm going to build in the trees. And I'm going to make it so impressive that every architect in the galaxy will have to admit that human engineering is anything but primitive. Jake spent the rest of the afternoon surveying the preserve, taking mental notes about tree selection, material availability, and construction possibilities. By the time they returned to campus, he had a rough plan forming in his mind. That evening, word about the challenge had spread throughout the student body. Jake found himself surrounded at dinner by curious aliens and supportive humans, all asking questions about his plans. You really think you can build something good enough to impress the evaluation panel? Asked Kron, his scales shifting to a worried brown color. I think I can build something that will make them reconsider everything they think they know about human engineering, Jake replied. Pip bounced excitedly in his chair. Can we help? The rules said no outside assistance, but they did not say no observers. Jake looked around the table at the mix of human and alien faces. Actually, that gives me an idea. What if this becomes more than just a construction project? What if it becomes a learning experience for everyone? Lisa raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean, what if I document everything? Explain the engineering principles as I work? Turn it into a demonstration of human construction philosophy, rather than just building a shelter? The aliens at the table looked intrigued. Several other students from nearby tables had stopped eating to listen. You would teach while you build? Asked a crystalline student whose species Jake didn't recognize. Why not? Professor Zethkari said, humans don't understand advanced engineering. I'll show exactly how much engineering goes into a proper treehouse. By the time I'm done, everyone will understand that human construction isn't primitive at all. It's just different. Jake looked around the cafeteria, which had grown surprisingly quiet as more students stopped to listen. In fact, I have a feeling this is going to be the most educational week any of us have had since we got here. Jake arrived at the Wilderness Preserve just after sunrise, carrying only the basic tools the administration had provided: a handsaw, hammer, measuring tape, rope, and basic survival gear. But he wasn't alone. Despite the rule about no outside assistance, Nearly 30 students had gathered at the edge of the preserve to watch. Even Dean Morteff was there, along with several other faculty members. "Remember," the dean announced, "Human Morrison may receive no direct assistance in construction. However, observers are permitted, and he may explain his methods for educational purposes." Jake nodded and walked into the preserve, heading straight for the massive oak tree he had selected the day before. The tree was easily 6 feet in diameter. At the base, with strong horizontal branches starting about 15 feet up. Perfect for what he had in mind. "First principle of treehouse construction," Jake called out to his audience as he began examining the tree more closely. "You don't build a house and then put it in a tree. You build with the tree. The tree becomes part of the structure, not just a support for it." He spent the first hour doing nothing but studying the tree's growth patterns, checking for signs of disease or weakness, and measuring branch angles and trunk diameter at various heights. The watching students grew restless, but Jake was methodical. "Human Morrison!" called out a tall, thin alien whose species Jake didn't recognize. "Are you going to build anything or just stare at vegetation all day?" Jake grinned. "I'm reading the tree's structural story. See these branch scars here?" He pointed to marks on the trunk. "This tree has survived at least 3 major storms in the past 50 years. The way it healed tells me exactly how it responds to stress. And these root formations tell me about soil stability and water access." He moved to a different side of the tree. "Every tree is different. Building with a tree means understanding its unique characteristics and working with them, not against them." By mid-morning, Jake had selected his primary support branches and began the actual construction. He started by creating what he called the foundation platform, using techniques his father had taught him years ago. Instead of rigid attachments that would stress the tree, he used a floating bracket system that allowed the platform to move slightly with the tree's natural motion. "Why is it not attached directly to the branches?" asked Pip, who had climbed up to get a better view. "Because trees are alive," Jake explained as he worked. "They grow, they move, they respond to wind and weather. A rigid attachment would either break the branch or break the platform. This system lets the tree and the structure move together as a single unit." As the day progressed, more students arrived. Jake found himself with an audience of nearly 50 beings from a dozen different species, all watching with fascination as the treehouse began to take shape. Even some faculty members had joined the crowd, though they tried to look like they were just passing by. Lisa had brought recording equipment and was documenting everything. "Jake, can you explain the load distribution system you're using?" Jake paused in his work to point out the support structure. Traditional ground-based construction fights gravity with rigid vertical supports. Tree-based construction works with gravity using flexible distribution networks. See how I'm spreading the load across multiple branches instead of putting all the weight on one support. The tree actually gets stronger under distributed load because it engages the natural tension systems in the wood. By the end of the first day, Jake had completed the basic platform and begun framing for the main structure. It didn't look like much yet, but the engineering principles were already apparent to anyone who understood construction. The second day brought new challenges and new spectators. Jake began working on the walls, using a technique that amazed even the engineering students. Instead of solid panels, he created a framework that would be filled with living materials. "I'm not just building a house," Jake explained as he worked. "I'm creating a habitat. These wall frames will be filled with local plants that will grow into the structure. In 6 months, the walls will be alive and self-maintaining. They'll provide insulation, air purification, and even food. Crohn's scales shifted to an impressed yellow. The walls will grow themselves? Exactly. And they'll get stronger and more effective over time instead of wearing out. That's what I meant when I said human construction improves the environment instead of just occupying it. Word of the project was spreading beyond the student body. By the third day, Jake looked down from his treehouse to see alien visitors from other institutes, government officials, and even some media representatives. What had started as a simple challenge was becoming a galactic event. "Human Morrison," called Dean Morteff from below. "You have attracted considerable attention. Are you prepared for this level of scrutiny?" Jake grinned and continued working on the rope bridge system that would connect multiple platforms. The more scrutiny, the better. Everyone should see what human engineering can really do. The rope bridges were perhaps the most impressive aspect of the construction. Instead of simple suspension systems, Jake created dynamic networks that actually strengthened under load. The bridges could support multiple beings while still allowing the tree to move naturally in the wind. "How is this possible?" asked one of the visiting engineering professors, a crab-like being whose species was known for their architectural expertise. "The bridge appears to become more stable when weight is added." Jake demonstrated by walking across the bridge while several other students added their weight. The structure adapted and strengthened automatically. It's based on spiderweb engineering. The tension network redistributes forces to create stability. The more stress you put on it, the more the system engages its support mechanisms. By the fourth day, the treehouse had grown into something truly remarkable. Multiple platforms connected by adaptive bridges, living walls that were already beginning to grow, a rainwater collection system using hollow reeds, and a natural ventilation system that used thermal differences to create air circulation without any mechanical systems. But Jake wasn't finished. On the fifth day, he began adding what he called the integration systems. Solar collection panels made from polished metal scraps and transparent plant membranes. A waste processing system that fed organic matter to the tree's root system. Even a communication network using vibrations transmitted through the tree's living wood. "This is not just a dwelling," observed one of the evaluation panel members who had arrived early. "This is a complete ecosystem." "That's the point," Jake said, putting finishing touches on the main living area. Human construction philosophy isn't about imposing artificial systems on natural environments. It's about creating partnerships between technology and biology. The living area was perhaps the most impressive space. The floor was a flexible platform that responded to movement like a natural surface. The walls were growing gardens that provided both beauty and function. The ceiling was the tree's own canopy, modified to control light and weather while maintaining the natural environment. On the sixth day, Jake added the final touches that would make his point impossible to ignore. He created spaces specifically designed for different alien physiologies. Crystalline beings could plug into mineral charging stations integrated into the tree's root system. Flying species had perches and aerial access points. Ground-dwelling species had ramps and platforms at multiple levels. "Human Morrison," said Dean Morteff, who had been watching the final day's work with obvious amazement. "You have created something unprecedented. This structure accommodates more species types than our own dormitory buildings." Jake climbed down from the treehouse for the final time before the evaluation. The structure towered above them, a perfect integration of human engineering and natural systems. It looked like it had grown there naturally, but every detail showed sophisticated understanding of physics, biology, and multi-species accommodation needs. 7 days. Jake said, looking up at his creation. 7 days to prove that. Human engineering isn't primitive. I think we've made our point. The crowd of observers, now numbering in the hundreds, began to applaud. The sound echoed through the forest, a chorus of approval from dozens of different species. Even some of the evaluation panel members were nodding with obvious approval. But Jake had one more surprise planned for the evaluation day, something that would turn his defensive construction project into an offensive statement about human capabilities and galactic law. Something that would make sure this incident was remembered throughout the galaxy for years to come. Jake woke before dawn on evaluation day, but not in the dormitory. He had spent the night in his treehouse, testing its comfort and functionality. The living walls had regulated temperature perfectly, the water collection system had provided fresh drinking water, and the flexible flooring had made sleeping more comfortable than his institute bed. As the sun rose through the forest canopy, Jake prepared for the most important presentation of his life. But first, he had something else to do, something that would change everything. He climbed down from the treehouse carrying a metal plate he had crafted during the construction process and a hammer. At the base of the great oak tree, he drove a stake into the ground and attached the plate. Then he stepped back and read aloud the words he had engraved in 17 different galactic languages. Notice of Territorial Claim. Under Section 847 of the Galactic Homestead Act, I, Jake Morrison of Earth, hereby claim this 40-acre wilderness preserve as sovereign human territory. Claim established through demonstrated habitation and sustainable development as required by galactic law. Claim filed this day with appropriate authorities. He had worked on the legal language for months, ever since he first learned about the homestead laws in his galactic politics class. The Galactic Education Council classified the wilderness preserve as unusable land, which under galactic law made it available for homesteading by any sentient being who could prove sustainable development. Jake had done his research thoroughly. His treehouse met every requirement for permanent habitation. His improvements to the land demonstrated sustainable development. His documentation proved continuous occupation during the required 7-day period. The claim was completely legal and absolutely unassailable. By the time the evaluation panel arrived at mid-morning, Jake's claim notice had already been discovered by early visitors. Dean Morteff arrived looking frantic, followed by what appeared to be every legal advisor the Institute employed. "Human Morrison!" the dean called out as he approached the tree. "What is the meaning of this territorial claim?" Jake climbed down from the treehouse wearing his best diplomatic smile. "Good morning, Dean Morteff. I filed a standard homestead claim on this property under galactic law. All the paperwork has been submitted to the appropriate authorities." One of the legal advisors, a tall gray alien with too many arms, stepped forward. "This is preposterous. This land belongs to the Galactic Educational Institute." "Actually," Jake said, pulling out a data pad with his research, "this land was classified by the Institute as unusable and worthless. Under Section 847 of the Galactic Homestead Act, any unoccupied land classified as unusable by its current owners automatically becomes available for homestead claims by any sentient being who can demonstrate sustainable development and permanent habitation." The legal advisor's gray skin turned several different colors as he frantically consulted his own data pad. "But you cannot just claim Institute property." "I'm not claiming Institute property," Jake replied calmly. "I'm claiming abandoned wasteland that the Institute declared unsuitable for any productive use. The legal distinction is quite clear in galactic law." Dean Morteff's compound eyes were darting between Jake and his legal team. Surely there must be some procedural error. No errors, Jake said. I've been researching galactic property law for months. Every form has been filed correctly, every requirement has been met, and every deadline has been observed. The claim is completely valid. The evaluation panel had arrived during this exchange and was listening with obvious fascination. The panel consisted of 5 architects and engineers from different species, all chosen for their expertise in construction and their neutrality regarding human capabilities. Perhaps we should proceed with the scheduled evaluation, suggested the panel leader, a crystalline being who looked similar to Professor Zeth Kari, but with blue coloring instead of purple. The territorial claim is a separate legal matter. Jake nodded and gestured toward his treehouse. Of course. Please, examine the structure. Test its stability. Check its systems. Evaluate its engineering. I'm confident it meets every standard for advanced construction. The panel spent the next 3 hours going over every aspect of the treehouse. They tested load-bearing capacity, examined the flexible joint systems, analyzed the living wall integration, and evaluated the multi-species accommodation features. Jake explained each system as they examined it, demonstrating the sophisticated engineering principles behind what might appear to be simple construction. The dynamic bridge network is particularly impressive, noted one panel member, a multi-armed being whose species was known for their mathematical precision. The load distribution algorithms are more sophisticated than our computer-designed systems, but it's all done with organic materials and hand calculations, added another, sounding amazed. No artificial computation required. The rainwater collection system drew particular praise. This exceeds the efficiency of most mechanical systems, observed the panel leader, and it requires no maintenance or energy input. But it was the living walls that truly impressed the evaluators. In just 6 days, the planted sections had already begun to grow into integrated systems that were clearly going to provide insulation, air purification, and food production. This is not just construction, said one panel member quietly. This is environmental integration at a level we have never seen. While the evaluation continued, more officials kept arriving. Jake noticed representatives from the Galactic Property Commission, several legal experts from different species, and even what appeared to be media representatives from major galactic news services. The territorial claim was becoming a bigger story than the construction challenge. Human Morrison. Dean Morteff approached as the evaluation panel finished their examination. We need to discuss this property claim situation. Surely we can reach some accommodation. Jake looked around at the growing crowd of officials, media representatives, and curious observers. Dean Morteff, I'm happy to discuss any reasonable proposal, but I should point out that my claim has attracted considerable galactic attention. The documentation of this entire project has already been viewed by millions of beings across the galaxy. Lisa had indeed been recording everything, and her documentation was being broadcast in real time through the Institute's academic network. What had started as a simple construction challenge had become a galactic event showcasing human engineering capabilities. The evaluation panel has reached its conclusion, announced the crystalline panel leader. We find that this structure demonstrates engineering sophistication far exceeding what we expected. The integration of biological and technological systems, the multi-species accommodation features, and the sustainable development approach represent advances in construction philosophy that we recommend for study by architects throughout the galaxy. A cheer went up from the crowd of student observers. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had proven his point about human engineering capabilities. But then the panel leader continued. However, we must also address the territorial claim. This structure was built on land now claimed as sovereign human territory. This raises complex questions about jurisdiction and authority that extend far beyond the scope of our architectural evaluation. Dean Morteff's mandibles clicked rapidly with agitation. Surely the claim cannot be legally valid. The head of the Galactic Property Commission, who had been reviewing Jake's documentation, stepped forward. Actually, the claim appears to be completely valid under current galactic law. All requirements have been met, all procedures have been followed, and all deadlines have been observed. The claimant has established permanent habitation and demonstrated sustainable development of previously unused land. Jake watched as the full implications of his legal maneuver began to sink in among the officials. He had not just built an impressive treehouse. He had claimed 40 acres of prime real estate in the heart of the galaxy's most prestigious educational institution. And he had done it completely legally. "What happens now?" asked Lisa, her recording equipment still running. Jake looked up at his treehouse, then at the crowd of officials and observers, then at the claim notice posted at the base of the tree. Now we find out whether the galaxy is ready to accept that humans are not just capable students, but equal partners in galactic civilization. The next few hours would determine not just Jake's future at the Institute, but the future of human-alien relations throughout the galaxy. 3 months later, Jake sat on the main platform of his treehouse, watching the morning sun filter through leaves that were now fully integrated into the living walls. What had started as a desperate attempt to prove human engineering capabilities had become something no one could have predicted. The 40 acres of former Wilderness Preserve were now the most visited location on the entire Institute campus. Every day brought new students, faculty members, and visitors from across the galaxy who came to study what was now officially called the Human Integration Habitat. Jake's territorial claim had been upheld by every legal challenge. The Galactic Property Commission ruled that his homestead was completely valid under existing law. The Institute's attempts to overturn the claim had failed in 3 different courts. Jake Morrison now owned 40 acres of prime real estate in the heart of the galaxy's most prestigious educational institution, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. But Jake had been smarter than anyone realized. Instead of keeping the land for himself, he had established it as an educational research zone available to students and faculty from all species. The legal ownership remained his, but the practical use belonged to the galactic community. The treehouse itself had grown into a complex of interconnected structures. Other students had built their own experimental dwellings throughout the 40 acres, each one exploring different aspects of sustainable architecture and multi-species accommodation. Kron had constructed a cliff-dwelling simulation that demonstrated how his people's mountain architecture could be adapted to forest environments. Pip's people had contributed aerial walkways that connected the canopy-level structures in a 3-dimensional transportation network. But the most significant change was in Jake's official status at the Institute. Dean Morteff had offered him a unique position as Cultural Integration Specialist, with authority to develop new curricula that bridged the gap between different species' approaches to engineering and architecture. Jake's first course, Building with Nature, Adaptive Architecture for Multi-Species Communities, had a waiting list that stretched for 3 semesters. Students from dozens of species wanted to learn the human approach to environmental integration. The course was held entirely in the Treehouse complex, with hands-on construction projects that let students experience the principles directly. "Human Morrison," called Dean Morteff, as he climbed up the access ramp Jake had built for non-climbing. Species, your morning visitors have arrived. Jake looked down to see a group of officials from the Galactic Urban Planning Commission. They had come to study the habitat as a potential model for sustainable city development. In the 3 months since the territorial,